Tracks it down in front. Matthews to Marner. Have to hurry. Scores! John Tavares, overtime winner!
This is absolutely unbelievable by Austin Matthews. A complete turnaround. Take the cake to Mitch Marner.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of From the Booth. I'm John Bartlett alongside Greg Millen. Today, we welcome one of the busiest broadcasters in our industry, Kenny Albert.
He does every network broadcast, it seems, in the U.S. for every major sport. A remarkable broadcaster, and it's a great interview I'm looking forward to.
And, of course, he comes from one of the biggest broadcast families in the industry as well. Please welcome our good friend, Kenny Albert. One of the busiest men in broadcasting and one of the nicest too. Always a pleasure to chat with our good friend, Kenny Albert. Kenny, how are you, my man?
I'm doing well, guys. Good to see you, John, and Greg as well. Love the background, Millsy.
Yeah, there's some old memories there for sure. I think we got to start off. How are you doing? And of course, you're in the New York area, so it's there's some tragic stories for sure coming out of your area.
Right, I'm doing well. Obviously, the number one priority. Hopefully, everybody's staying safe and staying healthy. I'm about 12 to 15 miles outside Manhattan. I'm in northern New Jersey and have not been to New York City since this all started over a month ago. I was actually on the road in Denver. The Rangers played a game in Denver on Wednesday night. I guess it was March 11th, the night the NBA postponed their season, and then we stayed over in Denver, flew home the next day. So here in New Jersey with my wife, two daughters who are 20 and 17. The older one was actually in Sydney, Australia for the semester.
Wow.
And she came home, I think, on the 19th or 20th. The night of that last game in Denver, it was sort of surreal, as I'm sure you guys would agree. You were following the same news I was. And about 7 o'clock Mountain Time, I saw the announcement that the NBA had canceled. And a couple of minutes later, the news came out about Tom Hanks and his wife, who were in Australia, where my daughter was, testing positive. And then about 5 minutes after that, she sends me a photo of herself climbing up a building. So that was sort of my 10-minute stretch. NBA cancels, Tom Hanks has COVID-19, and then my daughter's hanging off the side of a building in Sydney, Australia. So she had her fun for 2.5 months and flew home the next week.
Well, that about sums up everything that was going on in that time frame, doesn't it? Yeah.
Wow.
Pretty much. Well, let's start off with your beginnings, Kenny. Obviously, everyone knows the connection with your dad and how young you started. You've got some nice photos behind you there in your office as well. But you were so young and getting to see how your dad did it all from a very close range of being right beside him. Maybe you could talk a bit about your beginnings.
Sure. Grew up, obviously, with my father and his two brothers as well. My uncles, all sportscasters. And I was around it from such a young age. When I was 3-4 years old, I would tag along. So at the time, in the early 1970s, I was born in 68. And he was the voice of the New York Knicks and the Rangers on the radio side. And he was also doing the 6 and 11 o'clock sports on WNBC in New York. So he would go in about 12 or 1 in the afternoon to Manhattan, to 30 Rock, where they did the news from. And he would do the 6 o'clock news and then head over to MSG and work a game and then head back and do the 11 o'clock show. So he was pretty busy. And then through those years in the 70s and early 80s, he added football on NBC. He did some boxing, started to do basketball on television as well with NBC. So he was always busy and jumping around and traveling, but I thought it was the greatest thing. I was able to tag along, and he would take me to games, and I saw Greg Millen play back in the late 70s and early 80s.
That wouldn't be good.
And, I would get to go to all these games and travel once in a while. I was the oldest of 4, so I had the benefit of beginning to go on road trips before my younger brother and sisters, and then when they were old enough, we'd have to alternate between the 4 of us. But I wound up on the early side doing a lot of traveling. So I also received a tape recorder from my parents, I think for my 5th birthday. And it was a toy tape machine. And I would start to announce games into this recorder. And I set up my bedroom at the time. We lived on Long Island. And I set up my bedroom like a studio. I had my desk and the bed in the middle and the TV, and I would announce games into a tape recorder. And when I was old enough, I would start to bring it to actual games. And I think one of the key moments when I think back, when I was in high school in 10th grade in 1984, a small cable station came to my school to film a girls' basketball game. And I was there anyway. I used to cover the sports for the school newspaper. So I knew all the players. I knew the coaches. I had the rosters. And Cox Cable of Great Neck, they were going to film this girls' basketball game with 2 cameras and no announcers. So I volunteered. They clipped a microphone onto my shirt, and people around me probably thought I was crazy talking to myself in the stands. But I was actually announcing this game, and I met the producer after the game. His name was Roy Menton, great guy, passed away a couple of years ago. And we spoke on the phone the next day, and over the next 3 years, I volunteered. They weren't able to pay anyone, but it was such great experience. I didn't care. And I would bring my friends along as color analysts. And we would do basketball and hockey and baseball and football and lacrosse and soccer, hundreds of games in high school. So, while everybody else was going to parties and doing whatever they were doing, I was announcing games on Cox Cable. And at that time, a lot different than now, at that point, nobody my age, 15, 16, 17, really thought about doing this until college. So I felt like I had a 3-year head start. These days, there are all kinds of sportscasting camps in the summers. I speak at some of them. I'm sure you guys do as well, with kids as young as 12 and 13 years old. So they're starting now at a much younger age. So those 3 years were very important, doing the play-by-play, but also tagging along with my father. I kept the stats for him at Rangers games during high school and then Knicks games, and just learned via osmosis. And the biggest thing that I took in was the preparation, the amount of work and time that went into it. And even now, 30 years into a professional career, I never feel like I'm going to work. Even though there's a lot of work and prep and travel that goes into it, I feel very fortunate that I don't feel like I'm ever going to work.
Find a job you love and you'll never work a day in your life. Isn't that the truth? Yeah, bang on for sure with that. Now, you talked about being with your dad at the young age, but you had to sort of leave New York to find your own way. And this is what led you into the Great American Hockey League, where we can relate to that, as you went off to Baltimore, where you got your sort of real first break into pro hockey with the Skipjacks. Maybe talk a bit about what that meant for you to sort of have to leave your dad's shadow a little to carve your own path in Baltimore, which turned out to be a great experience for you.
It sure was. And aside from getting married and having children and some of the professional stuff that I've done since then, those were 2 of the greatest years of my life. When I think back to the 2 seasons in Baltimore, now I'll backtrack a little bit. So I went to college in New York at NYU, and I had 2 criteria when I was looking at colleges. Number 1, I wanted to be in or near an NHL city. I couldn't be away from the NHL for 4 years. So I was looking at schools in the Boston area, the DC area, Maryland. And I never really thought about staying close to home and going to school in New York. So that kind of came about a little bit later on. But I also had heard that a lot of the great broadcasting schools, and this is still the case to this day, that there were so many kids, 50, 75, 100 kids that wanted to do this, that you might not get an opportunity until your junior or senior year to be on the air. So through a few different circumstances, and I had met some people along the way that went there, I wound up going to NYU, New York University, in downtown Manhattan. I lived there, so I was still away from home. I was about 30 miles from home. The first couple of weekends as a freshman, I brought my laundry home on the train, and that became too much of a thing. I learned how to use the 25-cent machines in the basement of the dorm. So I was close to home. And I did see my family a lot, especially when they came into games in the city, and I would meet them at MSG. But I was still living on my own, or with a roommate in a dorm, but I was living away from home. And we had 5 or 6 of us at the radio station that were interested in doing sports. Now, it was a much smaller sports program. It was a Division III, a very good Division III sports program, and they had an excellent basketball team. No football, no baseball at the time. They have a baseball team now. And ironically, my freshman year, so I had played hockey growing up, wasn't very good, but I played on Long Island throughout my youth. And I thought that was it. I played club hockey in high school. I go to college, and I had played in some pickup games throughout the summer, and I figured that was the end of the playing career as far as hockey goes. September of '86, my freshman year of college, I see a flyer up in one of the buildings from another student who wanted to start a club hockey team. So this was tremendous. It was perfect timing. My freshman year, they start a club hockey team at NYU that's still going. They're going pretty strong now. They won a national championship at the club level a few years ago. This is a little-known trivia question. I didn't score many goals, but I did score the first goal in the history of NYU hockey back in September of '86.
Yeah.
It was the old Sky Rink, which was 2 blocks down from MSG. It was on 33rd Street between 9th and 10th on the 16th floor of a building. You would have to take the elevator up with your equipment, 16 floors, and there was the ice rink. And there were a lot of great stories to come out of Sky Rink. We used to play pickup games with a lot of other media members, and sometimes celebrities would join us along the way. But anyway, so I go to NYU, wind up playing club hockey, do the broadcasting for mostly men's and women's basketball, and there were only 5 or 6 of us, so we all got to do every job right from the start. Also, being in New York and having met some of the connections along the way by tagging along with family members, I wound up, it wasn't really an internship because they did pay us, but I wound up as a fill-in pre- and post-game show host for Islanders Radio. At the time, they were on a small station, WEBD, which happened to be, it actually was it wasn't a small station, but it wasn't a well-known station, but they were 50,000 watts. And their studios were 2 blocks from my dorm. So a gentleman named Joel Blumberg, who also unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, great guy, and did a lot for me early in my career. He was the producer of Islanders Radio and the engineer, and he would also do some of the pre- and post-game shows. So he hires me to help out and fill in. And as a senior in college, I wind up filling in on play-by-play on 4 games. And the first one was an Islanders game in Winnipeg, December 2nd, 1989. 21 years old. That was my first NHL pro game on the radio. And I was able to use that tape to send out to minor league teams. So I had an NHL tape of a real game, a real broadcast that I did. And I sent that out to minor league teams in the AHL and the East Coast League. And I had heard there was an opening in Baltimore. I knew a few people who knew people. And they told me about this opening in Baltimore. And Mike Haynes had been the broadcaster there, who went on to a long career with the Avalanche, won a couple of Stanley Cup rings. And in the summer of '90, he moved on to the Islanders franchise in Albany, Troy, New York, the Capital District Islanders. So I sent the tape to the Skipjacks, and a couple of weeks later, I hadn't heard anything. And I'm only a month out of college, so I didn't necessarily expect to get a job or hear anything at that level at any point soon. So a couple of weeks later, I made a phone call to the Skipjacks office, and their coach the previous season was Doug McLean. Now, he wound up becoming the assistant coach.
Oh, boy.
He wound up becoming the assistant coach with the Capitals that year, so I never actually worked with Doug with the Skipjacks.
You're lucky.
When I called the office, it was Doug who answered the phone. He actually picked up the phone in the Skipjacks office in the summer of '90 when I called down there to see if they had received my tape. And as it turns out, I was brought in for an interview. The owner, the late Tom Ebright, Tom and Joyce Ebright owned the team, and they were longtime American Hockey League owners, great people. And they had a summer home in Mount Gretna, Pennsylvania, outside Harrisburg. So they flew me in. A couple of the other gentlemen and women from the team front office were there. I do the interview. And then the next week, I fly out to Vancouver. This is how warped I was as a child, as a youngster. My graduation present from my parents was a plane ticket to Vancouver for the 1990 draft, because I was going to help out on a radio show. Joel Blumberg, who I mentioned, and the Islanders radio station, they were going to do a live show from the draft. So my graduation present was a plane ticket and a hotel room in Vancouver. And there were no cell phones back then. So I'm calling my home answering machine every day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday from Vancouver. And Friday afternoon, the day before the draft, I have a voicemail message that the Skipjacks wanted to hire me. And I remember I was so excited. I was all alone in my hotel room. So the draft is the next day. I go back to New York, and a week later, I load up my car and drive down to Baltimore. I don't know anybody down there. I wind up renting an apartment. And that summer, I was hired to do play-by-play. But, John, as you know, you do everything, sales, marketing, public relations. And I was not a great salesman whatsoever. I did not really enjoy that part of the job. I think I made 3 sales the entire summer. And we threw in everything. For $500, the sports bar and the gym at a hotel and a batting cage, golf, driving range, miniature golf facility. Those are my 3 hits over the course of the summer of 1990. We gave them season tickets, radio advertising, ads in the programs.
Yep.
The entire team come and play miniature golf at the facility one day. So we gave them whatever they wanted. So then October of 90, first game is at Hershey, the old Hershey Park Arena, October 6th, 1990, Baltimore Skipjacks, Hershey Bears. And during the preseason, the gentleman came over to the broadcast booth. I was doing practice games, rehearsal games in the preseason in Baltimore. And a gentleman comes over who, Greg, you might have played for at some point in Pittsburgh, Gene Ubriaco.
I did not, but I know him because he's a Sioux boy, is he not, originally? Yeah. Big name in the Sioux.
He grew up with the Espositos, with Phil and Tony.
Yeah.
He had coached the Baltimore Clippers, who became the Skipjacks, and then he coached the Skipjacks, and guys like Phil Bork and Bob Airy and Marty McSorley had played for Gene in the late 80s.
Okay, yeah. Remember when he was there?
He was the coach of the Penguins in 88, 89, if I'm getting the years right. And he was let go, and he moved back to Baltimore. His children were in high school at the time playing lacrosse, and that's where his wife was living. And Gene moved back. They had stayed there. They were based in Baltimore even when he was up in Pittsburgh. And he moved back, and he wasn't working, and he came over and introduced himself. And obviously I knew who he was. He had coached in the NHL the year before. And he volunteered. He said, look, I'm not doing anything. I'm going to come to all these games. If you want a color analyst, I'm happy to work the home games with you. And again, wasn't getting paid, just wanted to do it. So Gene was my color analyst for most of the home games whenever he was able to show up. He made the trip up to Hershey for the first game. They were our closest rival. It was an hour and a half up I-83 to I-81. 2 roads, Baltimore to Hershey. And first game. So I had done the 4 Islander games the year before. Now it's my first full-time job with the Skipjacks. And we're in this small broadcast booth at Hershey, great atmosphere. You can't hear anything. It's so loud. The headsets are on. In the second period of my first game, I get handed a note from the press box right in front of us. Call your station. You're off the air. At this point, I think I'm going to get fired after my first game. So, as I'm sure you had to do for many years, John, I was my own engineer. We had antiquated radio equipment, and it was plugged into a phone jack underneath the table. And either Gene or myself at some point kicked it out. Phone plug from the jack. We had a phone, a secondary phone. The station was trying to call us on this phone, but I couldn't hear anything. I had a headset on and it was loud. So needless to say, we got back on the air. I didn't get fired. Gene did color for me at many of the home games. Rob Laird was our head coach.
Yeah.
He's now a scout with the LA Kings and won 2 Stanley Cup rings with the LA organization. He had played for the Fort Wayne Comets and coached there. Robbie played 1 game in the NHL with the Minnesota North Stars, but a long-time minor league coach. He was the head coach. Our assistant coach and my road roommate was a fellow by the name of Barry Trotz, who you may have heard of.
Wow.
He was the assistant coach with the Skipjacks. And to save money, they had the radio broadcaster. So I was 22 years old. Barry Trotz was 27 or 28. We were road roommates for that first season. And then my second season as well, he took over as head coach in February that year, replaced Rob Laird, who was let go by Washington. And Barry said to me, we can't break the karma. We have to still room together. So now I'm rooming with the head coach. And I know I'm giving a long-winded answer, but the one story that Barry loves telling every time I see him, and, as you guys know, he's such a terrific individual. He's a great
ever. Yeah.
If you met him on the street, you would have no idea. He's a professional hockey coach who won a championship and is in the top quarter and wins all time. He's just a regular guy, has a great family. I was so happy when he won the Stanley Cup 2 years ago with Washington. So happy for him. But the top story that stands out from my days with Barry and the Skipjacks, and I hope I'm not taking up too much time.
I love it. We're loving this.
I know where you're going with this, and I was going to ask you, tell the story, so go for it.
So the one time a year that we actually flew, Everything was a bus ride within the U.S. We would fly to the Maritimes in Canada and play the 5 or 6 teams up there, and we'd be up there for 12 days and then fly home. So in 92, we're flying, I think it's January, February, we're flying to Baltimore to Boston, Boston to Halifax, Halifax to Sydney, 3 flights that day, lined up in Sydney, Nova Scotia. And earlier that season, I had taped a pregame interview with Trotzy, and he said something that came out the wrong way. It came out funny. I didn't use it on the air, but I made the mistake of playing that tape after the game for some of the players on the team bus in front of Barry. And word got back to him, of course, and he said to me, "I'll get you back one of these days, don't worry." So it's 3 or 4 months later, and we get off the plane on the tarmac in Sydney, and it was a small plane, 30-seater, and they had told us when we took off initially that our luggage might not make it until the next day. The hockey equipment and the sticks were the priority. So I knew that, and, you know, me, of course, as a 22-year-old, rookie, my luggage was probably 5 times the size as anyone else. You know, the players would bring a small bag with a couple of pairs of underwear and socks and a couple of shirts. They'd wear the same suit every day.
Toothbrush.
I brought 2 big suitcases with 4 suits and 8 dress shirts. Just ridiculous when I think back. So I figured the luggage didn't make it, and I had to identify. So we get off the plane, and this gentleman with the clipboard, and he says, "Is this you?" He had my name marked down. He said, "Can you come with us?" I thought I would have to identify what my luggage looked like so they can get it to the hotel the next day. So I'm in this room, and he starts questioning me. "Is your passport valid? Have you ever been arrested? Do you know anyone that's in trouble? Do you have anything illegal in your luggage?" And I'm answering no to every question. And finally, these 2 older gentlemen put me in an unmarked car. I could tell I wasn't being kidnapped. It was an official car with computer equipment up front. And they start driving around. And the team had gotten on the bus on the tarmac. And they start driving around, and they're continuing to ask me these questions. And again, I didn't think I was being kidnapped. I didn't at the time think that maybe someone's playing a practical joke on me. So I really had no clue what was happening. And after about 15 minutes, they pull up to what looks like a hotel. And the one gentleman says to me, "We have one final question. Do you know Jimmy Wiseman?" Jimmy was the long time, and he's still there, security man for the Washington Capitals.
Yeah.
And you have both seen him, you know him.
Know Jimmy well.
Turns out Jimmy's brother was one of the police chiefs up in Sydney. So every year, either Barry Trotz or one of the other coaches or assistant coaches with the Skipjacks and with the Capitals, they would set somebody up, a trainer or broadcaster, and nobody would ever talk about it because they didn't want next year's victim to find out. So that was my fake arrest story with Barry with the Skipjacks. Now, he also tells a story, most of it's correct. We had a road trip to Utica, New York, and we had played the night before somewhere. We got in about 3 in the morning to a Holiday Inn or a Ramada Inn, and it was the middle of a snowstorm. And we check in, and we have a room on the first floor, and it's freezing. The heat's not working in the room. The snow is coming under the door, and we're both sleeping in our clothing, in our winter coats. And the way he tells the story now, 29 years later, is that I asked him to cuddle, but that was certainly not the case. We had separate beds. I could picture what the hotel room looked like. There was cuddling involved.
Kenny, I know we don't have a lot of time, but I do want to get into your career now. I mean, for me, I don't even know how you do it year-round. I mean, you cover every major sport in the U.S., including the National Football League. And first of all, how do you juggle your time, number one? And number two, how do you switch sports as a play-by-play man the way you do and shift gears for the different styles of game? I find it remarkable as a color man that only does one sport.
Well, I appreciate the kind words, Greg. I've been real fortunate. My goal when I was growing up, I wanted to do hockey on the radio. That was it. Hockey was my favorite sport. Like I said, I played hockey not very well. That's really what I wanted to do, and was real fortunate to get the job with the Skipjacks. And I was in Baltimore for 2 years, and then was hired by Home Team Sports in D.C. To do the Capitals home games for 3 years. They had a split package, so Craig Laughlin and I did the home games for 3 years. The third was the strike-shortened season, 94-95. And they had a separate play-by-play announcer for road games on another station, and it was Jeff Rimmer for a couple of years before he went down to Florida. And then it was Joe Beninati. and they're both good friends. And
Yeah.
Joe wound up taking over all of the Capitals games when I moved up to New York, and he's been there for 25 years. And Jeff's had a terrific career now in Columbus for the last 15 years or so. So we were all sort of together at the same time. Ron Weber was doing radio. And I had 3 great years in Washington, and that's really where I started to pick up some of the variety. I had done a number of sports in high school, as I mentioned, but when I was in Washington doing hockey, Home Team Sports, HTS, which is now, it became Comcast, and it's now NBC, and I filled in. They asked me to fill in on some basketball games and baseball games and a lot of college sports. And that really set the tone as far as working some of these other sports. And then a huge break was in 1994, late 93, early 94, when Rupert Murdoch and Fox came in and stole the NFC football package from CBS, who had it for 35, 37 years. And I had never dreamed or imagined of doing football play-by-play on television. All of the football guys were older, in their 50s and 60s. They had all been at it for a long time. But Fox made the decision to hire some older crews, Hall of Fame guys, Pat Summerall and John Madden, who are iconic, Dick Stockton and Matt Millen. And they also decided to hire some younger play-by-play announcers and color analysts. Myself, Joe Buck, Tom Brenneman, Kevin Harlan. We were all in our 20s back then. And I'm proud to say that 3 of us are still at Fox, and Kevin Harlan's at CBS and Turner, and we're all still there 25 years later. So that was a huge break, being in the right place at the right time. The last football game I worked before that was a Division III college game in New York in like 1989. I don't think Joe had ever done football, and he's worked about 5 or 6 Super Bowls now and does an unbelievable job, and 20-plus World Series. And so I start with Fox doing football. They wound up getting baseball a couple of years later. And then at MSG, where I've done the Rangers, primarily radio for 25 years, I've also filled in for the last decade or so on a number of New York Knicks games every year. So real lucky how the jigsaw puzzle kind of worked out with the 2 employers. And then I've added NBC hockey and a lot of playoff hockey over the last 7 or 8 years as well. So all of the bosses are great as far as the jigsaw puzzle and allowing me to miss certain events here or there. And there are others as well who do the same thing, but very lucky. And again, never feel like I'm ever going to work. There's a lot of preparation and organization involved, and you have to keep on top of everything, but there's nothing else that I'd rather be doing.
I know John wants to talk about one incident that's Toronto-centric a little bit. We don't have a lot of time, John, but bring that one up, would you? Because
you had a chance to call the Jose Bautista bat flip in the 2015 ALDS with the Blue Jays, which is a big moment for a lot of Jays fans.
Well, it's certainly a moment that I get asked about a lot, and it was a huge moment to be a part of that. And it's funny, you guys, I'm sure, are the same way. Sometimes you go into a game and something happens that you never expect, and it becomes a big moment. Through the years, when I get asked about the most memorable games that I've worked, I've worked 6 or 7 Stanley Cup Finals on the radio side for NHL Radio and Westwood One, and wound up in '94. Howie Rose had done the '93 NHL Radio with Mike Keenan, ironically, and the next year the Rangers go to the finals, so Howie's a little busy. He was doing the Rangers at the time, and Mike Keenan's coaching the Rangers, and I had the opportunity to work that series before I started working for the team for NHL Radio. And I don't want to bore you with a long story, but I wound up meeting my wife during that series, and we probably would not have met had I not been up there working NHL Radio in '94. So that series certainly stands out. Calling the women's hockey gold medal game at the Olympics in 2018 is definitely up there. A number of football playoff games that I've called through the years. But the Bautista home run, that's the one that I probably get asked at, whether it's social media or on interviews, probably more so than any of the others. And it's ironic because I do so much more hockey than baseball. I do about 10 to 15 baseball games every year with Fox during the regular season, and I've worked playoffs now the last 5 or 6 years. And that was a series that wound up going 5 games. Game 5 was in Toronto, and it was in the late afternoon. And that home run and bat flip took place during the 7th inning, which I think took 43 minutes. It was a crazy inning.
Yeah.
All kinds of stuff going on, but I'll never forget the intensity and how loud it was in the building in Rogers Center at the time. And certainly a moment that I'll never forget. And fortunately, people don't let me forget about it.
Well, 5 Winter Olympics, 1 Summer Olympics, as you said, a plethora of sports and great memories to have and great stories to share as well. We'll have to get you back on another time to share more of the great tales, but you got to love the Baltimore connection. And you and Barry Trotz, it's a little different, right? When you come up through the American League, the connection you have with players and coaches along the way, we can relate to that. And I love that story of Trotsy getting you back on the good clip.
By the way, one of my 2 years in Baltimore, Joel Quenneville played about 40 games with our team, with the Skipjacks. So on that bus, you had Barry Trotz and Joel Quenneville, who are now both 2 of the top 4 winningest coaches of all time.
Unbelievable. Former teammate of mine and Joel Quenneville. I got lots of stories. And someday, Kenny, on the road, I'll tell you about the St. Louis snipe hunt. It's a very similar situation, but that's for another day. But it sure is great to have you on. You've done everything. What a start our business, and so nice to see you.
Well, it's been great chatting with you guys. Stay safe. It's been a lot of fun. Let's do it again soon. And I have a lot of questions for you guys as well. So great success with it. And again, love the background, Millsy.
Yeah, well, it's all I could find, Kenny.
Well, this Team Canada, but. Best of your families, and hopefully we'll all be at hockey arenas real soon.
Absolutely.
You bet. Thanks very much, Kenny. Always a pleasure to catch up with Kenny Albert. We always have a great chat at the rink, back with our AHL stories as well. But I love the fact how he talked about when he started with that local cable station coming into his high school to do a game back when he was 15. Reminded me of a young guy who had the same kind of story, where all of a sudden a cable station needed you to jump in and call your first game, and that's how it happened. So you never know where it leads to when you're starting young like that. I guess Kenny and I share that same kind of passion.
That was you?
That was me.
What a strapping young man you were there. And it's funny how all you young guys found a way to get into the field that way. The more we talk to play-by-play men, the more we hear about it, and women, the more we hear that's how they get their start. Amazing, though.
And the key to longevity, staying young at heart.
Correct.
There you go. That'll do it for this edition of From the Booth. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.